All right, how we doing? This is coming through. Let me know if there's any weird sounds going. I have lots of fans happening right now to supplement the air conditioning. I can try to turn those off if the need may arise. What day is it? Today is Wednesday, July 2nd, 2025. I've lost track of time too. So, I want to take a look at this, and it's a video by a YouTuber called Freda called YouTube Medievalists Are Weird, Metatron, Lindy Beige, and Shadiversity. And I will fully attest to the fact that Shadiversity is a weird, weird little guy. Lindy Beige, we'll see. Metatron I had not watched before. And who doggy? Metatron is going to start making some appearances on this channel, and he's not going to like them. Anyway, let's start and go from there.
When I was younger, like most teenagers who were into fantasy and history, I was also into medieval history because it had knights and swords and all that cool stuff. I read the Jan Guillou Arn series as a kid and later in life read James Clavell's Shogun. In my teenage years, I played Shogun 2 Total War and Crusader Kings 2. I'm sure this kind of thing tracks for many of you as well. In terms of actually learning about this stuff, I didn't really have much of an idea where to start. Enter youtube.com. The early algorithm and my more sword and HEMA obsessed friends very quickly started serving me videos from seemingly knowledgeable individuals talking directly into a camera and occasionally showing off their swords. Then, as I began my undergraduate studies and started learning more not just about history but also about how history is written, I started getting bored with these videos, verging on actively disliking some of them. I started
That kind of describes my feeling about a lot of history tube. Although, to be fair, it wasn't as much of a thing when I was younger than it was now. And so I kind of entered with a bad feeling about most of history YouTube. There's some channels I like, to be fair, but a lot of it is like a lot of history YouTube is just really nicely animated Wikipedia articles at best and active disinformation at worst. And like sorting through that is kind of a chore. Um, it's not. It's YouTube is tricky because like it's obviously very useful for mass market. And like getting a message out to a lot of people, but it's not really useful for making people aware of original research because that's not the kind of thing that grabs you in the algorithm or works for you in the algorithm. So like all the time you're going to see a whole bunch of stuff coming out of like real historians work on new topics and new ideas about old topics that won't be reflected in the YouTube video that tells you the story of how the Russian Navy was almost sunk 6 times on the way to the a battle of Tsushima five or six times. It's obviously fake. So like I get a certain amount of trepidation with YouTube videos on history, and I would include almost anyone in that because it's so easy to not know what you don't know and not know what's new.
noticing that a lot of the channels often relied heavily on rationalization and logic, not on evidence or sources. This is a phenomenon that I observe with a lot of reenactment content on YouTube. They sometimes use primary source materials as a jumping off point, but from then on begin to rationalize how, quote, things worked back then based on their own personal experience. You might hear them say something like, if they did X, then Y would happen. That doesn't make much sense, so they probably did Z. It's all argumentation and deduction based on what they believe, their preconceived notions, and their experiences. This approach to history can very quickly become problematic for many different reasons, but with these YouTubers, I think something unique starts to happen. When the so-called history that they teach doesn't have to be backed up or justified by its connection to the sources, and when their personal experience takes primacy, then they start to believe themselves to be far more knowledgeable and qualified than they actually are. They begin to quote-unquote reason themselves towards every answer. And for some reason, the end result of this development almost always looks like an hour-long video essay about why women don't belong in video games. The plan
oh, oh, okay. Sorry, that was funny. Yeah, no, this is a particular thing. Like reenactment is cool, but it's also incredibly limited, right? We can only go by, in those cases, accounts of what we have. You get this a lot. There's a Hema channel I like. You see him doing shorts. It's what's his face with a ponytail. Uh, Cell Sword Arts. That's the one. That's the guys. Um, they'll do a lot of shorts where they kind of point out the problems with relying on sources absent context. In particular, where they talk about how HEMA is limited in its very to dueling as opposed to what it might be battlefield applications of a given weapon. And I think that's a very, you have to be able to ground yourself in the source you're working. We've talked about context. We've talked about context on the channel before, and you have to be able to ground yourself in sources uh, in order to really be able to understand the limitations of the source you're using. And your personal experience will never do that for you.
And here is to revisit 3 channels that I watched something like a decade ago, those being Lindy Beige, Metatron, and Shadiversity, to see where they are now and try to figure out what's going on with them. When I'm not bogged down in research for one of these videos, you might think I'm doing something otherwise intellectually stimulating. You would be wrong. I'm watching British reality TV. The other day I was going to watch Come Dine With Me with my girlfriend. If you're not familiar, 4 people each take turns inviting the others to their to social and political stability. Surfshark can be used on an unlimited number of devices and is available on mobile and desktop. If you're interested in a VPN, go to Surfshark.
Was Nazism left-wing?
Okay, I haven't watched Metatron much before, except for now, as of this week. Whoo, doggy, this is a bad history channel. Very bad.
Test to figure out his politics and understanding of history.
Was Nazism left-wing or right?
Months of Surfshark VPN. Let's get back to the Medievalists. First up, Metatron. Luckily, he has provided us with a perfect Rorschach test to figure out his politics and understanding of history.
Was Nazism left-wing or right-wing?
This is not going to be good. Was Nazism left-wing or right-wing? This is a weird question, right? If you're asking, was Nazism... Okay, let's rephrase that. If the question you're trying to ask is Adolf Hitler going to vote for Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, you're asking the wrong question. Because we don't really know that, and there's no way to quantify that in any meaningful sense. If you're asking a question about where on an ideological spectrum does Nazism fit, in so far as our understanding is concerned, you can reasonably answer this question. The left versus right spectrum is kind of, it's old at this point. It comes from the French Revolution, and the where you sat in the General Assembly in France generally defined whether you were left wing or right wing as a party, and this has kind of carried over. So you can reasonably answer that question, I think. Let's see where this goes.
This question is a form of ahistorical syllogism. In my opinion,
Wait, what? I'm sorry.
this question is a form of ahistorical syllogism.
Okay. Ahistorical syllogism. Is Nazism left wing, or that's not a syllogism? That's not a syllogism at all. Ahistorical syllogism. A syllogism is a particular form of argumentation. It has a pair of premises, one leading into the next, which leads into a conclusion. That's a syllogism. This isn't a argument. It's a question, which would make it not a syllogism to begin with. Ahistorical would make it something that hadn't happened. That off the bat doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
In my opinion, there are two major problems here. One, they use the American left-right dichotomy or political spectrum, and they forcefully apply it to historical European political regimes and ideologies. Two, they use 21st century political spectra and juxtapose them over 20th century politics.
The core
There is a particular problem already here. The political spectrum is French, like I just mentioned. It's from the 18th and 19th centuries. and it has remained a fairly significant and reliable indicator of where a political party sits for the last 300 years, uh, give or take. The word you're looking for, if you're trying to make this particular argument, by the way, is your analysis presentist, as in, do you inappropriately overlay your understanding of a given culture over, or a given event over the story you're trying to tell. It's a way of messing up historical analysis. And this is tricky, right? Because obviously you do not want to apply your own values to your evaluation of a source or any given set of sources. But at the same time, you can't not, to a certain degree, to a certain degree, relate history back to something that we understand as the audience of the historian. And so what I mean by that is, if you could see everything in history all at once, it would be useless, because you don't know what you don't know. You have no way of relating to people of the past. There's this movie, a 1990s, mid 1990s movie, Disney, and it's an older story that they made a movie of, but I love the movie in particular because it's fucking buck wild. It's called A Kid in King Arthur's Court. And it's a pretty simple premise. Basically, this earthquake rips this hole in the time-space continuum, and this dorky kid goes through the hole and ends up in Arthur's Camelot. And what follows is this kid and these Camelot dwellers trying to relate to one another. Like, there's this great scene in the movie where he has to get into a fight to save the princess, and he can't beat the knight. So what he does is he pulls out his Walkman and shines the laser in his eyes. And the guy falls over the ledge. And like, it's funny and it's a great movie premise, but it's not something that works. You don't have a way to relate to the past in that sense. Like, if you were to drop back in 9th century England, you wouldn't even speak the same language. Or move on to 12th or 13th century where English is being spoken, you wouldn't even speak the same English. There is a degree to which we have to take things in terms that we understand them, and a degree to which we have to relate them to history. And this is a balance that you have to strike. And it's one of the things that you learn how to do if you are becoming a historian and taking classes and getting an education. And that isn't to say you can't learn to do it on your own, but like, this is a conversation I've had with some people privately. Every history undergrad has a moment that they get walloped in a class because they did not properly consider sources, and they did not properly consider the scope of what they were arguing. And I'm going to tell you what mine was right now in college. I was doing an American history class, and we were talking about prohibition. And I was talking about prohibition and how it came about and how it was advocated for politically. And I focused very heavily on right-wing and left-wing organizations such as socialists and anti-immigration nativist factions. And my instructor pointed out that I had completely ignored women. And it's true. If you look at the history of prohibition, the advocacy of women plays a very significant role in prohibition being passed in the United States. Everyone has that moment where they get that paper that tells them you've fucked up. If you never do that, you never learn to look past your own biases.
Part of this issue in regards to this is a phenomenon called presentism.
Oh,
though he doesn't use that word.
Oh, good. He's going to do it anyway. Yeah, presentism.
Because it's a word an actual historian would use. Instead, he calls it an ahistorical syllogism. Presentism is a complicated subject, and there's varying definitions and ways to use the term. But one use of the term is to describe the way in which the present exerts pressure on the historian's construction of the past. You are continually being shaped and reshaped by what you experience and by the society around you. This can push and pull you towards interests, approaches, and methods which can influence or shape the ways in which you approach history. The sources, the so-called facts that you observe are all the same, but the angle that you approach them at, the facts you decide that are relevant to the history and the ones that aren't, are all things influenced by who you are. The issue about this complaint about history that wants to put the historian outside of the historian's context is that it essentially wishes for a history without the historian. You're asking for an analysis of history that stands apart not just from the historian, but also from the time in which the analysis is being conducted. A history that exists as an objective and true story to be simply uncovered, untainted by interpretation. This is...
Yeah, this is a real problem, this kind of viewpoint. It's one that I push back heavily on because it's the core of the phrase, everything is political. You don't get to exclude things because they're emotional or not fact-based in your mind, because they are fact-based, but what they might be is inconvenient facts to your narrative. I really like the book, and it's kind of cliche, but I really like the book Lies My Teacher Told Me. It's old at this point, but what it does is it takes a number of history textbooks and it highlights the manner in which stories do not allow for in American history, and American history textbooks do not allow for alternative viewpoints, indigenous viewpoints, people of color, etc. And it highlights how including those viewpoints can change students' perceptions of the past. This gets pushed back on a lot of times as being not factual or not rooted in just the facts, ma'am, history. And I think that's unfortunate in a lot of ways, because it causes us to de-emphasize the very real role that people of color and indigenous people and other groups that are typically ignored in American history textbooks play in either being acted upon or acting upon history. So yeah, that's a very, very real problem.
Impossible to accomplish. History has to fit into modern understandings of the world, and this, alongside many other things, of course, might be a point where me and Metatron fundamentally disagree. But I don't actually think so, and I'll explain why later on. To close off this point about history being a conduit between the past and the present, let me quote American historian Ha-Seok Chang. Quote, "Even though history is about the past, history writing is for those who are living in the present. Even if you could climb into Aristotle's head, as Kuhn was fond of recommending, how would you know how to navigate inside it? And if you somehow really succeed in thinking and talking just like Aristotle and his contemporaries, how would you come back and tell the rest of us what you've learned? If you could truly attain this ideal of historiography, you would be Aristotle, and we would need other historians to decipher for the rest of us what you're saying. The completely faithful history, if one could achieve it, might just be the past itself. Like Borges's perfect map that is just the terrain itself, and therefore completely useless." He proposes the following
I like that quote.
slogan, quote, "Like funerals, history writing is for the living." The analogy to the map is a really good one. Imagine a perfect recreation of the past. Everyone would be left to sift through all the data points themselves and to draw their own conclusions. We would have all the information available to us, and we would know and understand none of it.
Expecting therefore 21st century American political ideas to overlap neatly and perfectly with 20th century European political factions in order to come out with an answer is a flawed analytical method.
I mean, it is, but that's not what I think people are driving at this question. There's two levels to this question, I think, to be perfectly blunt. The first is going to be the person who's asking the question because they want to tar a political opponent. It's obviously known that if you invoke Hitler as your political guidepost, you lose. Therefore, whoever side Hitler is on is automatically losing. That's a big thing to do, and it leads into a lot of people making really stupid arguments about the Nazis. And if that's the question you're asking, of course you're engaging in a flawed analytical method. But if we're asking generally, what are the Nazis and their policies, we can broadly answer this question. What do they most resemble that are like policies we can connect to the past of their contemporaries, who were at that time left or right themselves? Like, these aren't things that are born in a vacuum. Or what do we connect them to policies today? Because, like, if you are, in fact, the intellectual heir of Hitler, perhaps you should stop. And I'm talking to you, Stephen Miller. You in particular, you are not that dissimilar age from me, and you look like you're dead. Evil does that to you, son.
Yes, trying to figure out if Hitler was a, quote, "I'm with her" guy or a member of the Republican Party in 2016 is silly. But luckily, that is not what historians and others are actually doing when they approach this topic.
What do we do now? Well, to answer this correctly, first, we need to ensure objectivity to our analysis.
These guys very
What the fuck does that even mean? Objectivity to our analysis. You, as an individual, cannot assure objectivity to your analysis. You are a biased person. All people are biased people, and you cannot escape your biases. Here's what you don't trust in life. You don't trust the guy who says they're objective and non-emotional, because that guy's going to get real emotional real quick. Good rule for you ladies, too. Second, you don't trust the guy who doesn't say their biases up front. You know my biases. I will tell you what they are when they happen, before they happen, because it's important that you know that when you're evaluating what I say. Those are the two people you never trust.
Often present themselves as, quote, rational skeptics who are just presenting the objective facts. I talked more about this method in my previous video, whereby it was used by a literal out-and-about Nazi. The general gist of it is to
Yeah, Zoomer Historian was a real piece of work. History is not apolitical. There are no such thing as just the facts, ma'am. Facts always have presentation bias and skew to them.
politicize history as a science, and to portray it as a series of crystallized, unchanging facts which just so happen to correspond to the person's worldview. You assert things as, quote, just the facts and reason your way towards why these so-called facts you're presenting are true, without relying on much evidence produced by trained historians. You sidestep the actual debates and uncertainties of history in order to simplify the larger picture. The point is to cleverly avoid actually engaging with history and instead relying on debate and argumentation.
Oh no, we've been tricked. It's Vosh.
I've talked about so-called objective history in past videos. I'll summarize by saying history is aspirationally objective, but practically cannot be objective because the fundamental nature of the field necessitates all sorts of selection.
Yeah, that's very fair, I think. Like, the idea that a good historian is aiming for is that they're going to present as complete a picture as they can. There are a lot of bad historians out there, by the way, just as a preface to that. There's a lot of trouble with this, like, is a thing. There's a lot of pressure to be the guy to present the secret history. There's a lot of pressure to be the guy who is objective, because it's comforting to have a set of facts. In December 7th, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Just the facts. Next quote. On December 7th, 1941, Japan launched an unprovoked attack against the United States of America in Pearl Harbor. Is it really unprovoked? The United States launched an embargo of Japan in response to Japan's own crimes in China, and less so in Korea, but mostly in China. Is that unprovoked? Is it the same level of provocation? A debate can be had around that second sentence. It's not just the facts. Some people will try to ignore that debate, but a debate can be had around that sentence. You can look at the scholarship. You can look at additional information. You can expand that information. And this comes down to my problem with a lot of history channels and how a lot of history channels operate. They'll give you an event in isolation. A lot of the little ones, like a lot of the ones that do like events, like Operations Room is a good one for this. They'll give you the list of things that happened in a conflict or a battle, and they won't really give you much of the front or the back of it. So it's hard for you to contextualize what you're watching beyond a simple expression of, well, this is what happened. And while this is what happened is important, it's not history. It's just a recitation. You haven't synthesized anything. You haven't explored anything or explained anything. You haven't done anything or engaged with any debate. You've simply listed a set of events. And it's comfortable for people, right? They want to see a set of events. They want a set of simple facts they can take and digest and spit back out when next time they see a History Channel documentary to go, ah, that's wrong. That's not history.
Action and interpretation that cannot be fully divorced from subjectivities. Here's a quote by E.H. Carr from his book What is History? Quote, "The facts of history cannot be purely objective, since they become facts of history only in virtue of the significance attached to them by the historian. Objectivity in history, if we are still to use that conventional term, cannot be objectivity of facts, but only of relation, of the relation between the fact and interpretation, between past, present, and future."
Focus on attitudes towards private property, individual freedom, and wealth redistribution patterns. If
Uh-oh. Anytime someone mentions wealth distribution, you have to wonder, what they're getting at, because you'll never notice that no one ever talks about the redistribution of wealth from the bottom to the top. They always talk about it in terms of wealth redistribution, as you're taking wealth from the top to the bottom, and that's a bad thing. Tisk tisk. I think Metatron is about to predict that Nazism, or say that Nazism is a left-wing ideology, and who boy is he going to run around some problems.
Needed even implementing a mathematical apparatus.
What does he even mean by this?
Also, we should explore and
Hang
take
on, I got to go listen to that again.
private property, individual freedom, and wealth redistribution patterns. If needed, even implementing a mathematical apparatus.
Wait, what? Why would you do that? How okay. What mathematical equation? I want to know now. I want to know what mathematical equation that you can use to calculate where a political party falls on the political spectrum. Like, is there number values assigned to that? Is the number value assigned to the right wing 88? Is it 14? Just checking.
What does he even mean by this?
Also, we should explore and take into consideration the political allegiances that occurred historically and the sort of opposition to the regime in question, the Nazis. So let's do...
Okay, but this is a fairly easily answered question. Who opposed the Nazis? Who opposed the right-wingers in Weimar Germany? It was the communists and the socialists.
that.
Now, he says we're going to evaluate whether these regimes lean left or right based on those criteria, but first he constructs a new category called totalitarian dictatorship.
What defines totalitarianism? Centralized authority, strength in the military, militarism with resources directed to domestic population, authoritarianism and dictatorial rule, repression of freedom.
What defines totalitarianism? Authoritarianism and dictatorial rule. So, okay. This in particular is just tautological. What is totalitarianism? Oh, it's authoritarianism. Yes. Okay. And repression of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Strength in the military. Centralized authority. Like, these are really vague on a significant level, right? Okay. So, like, let's talk about this, because I'm pretty sure this is one of those clowns who used to dress up in segmentum Roman armor and talk about Rome a lot. Centralized authority. Centralized relative to what? You can describe Rome at various times as centralized authority. Is it totalitarian? Well, does totalitarianism exist as a concept for Rome? No, it doesn't. Strength in the military, what does that mean? This is his slide as well, so the language is like key here. Strength in the military isn't strengthen as in we're going to strengthen the military. It's your strength is in the military. What does that mean? This is vague and doesn't get you to a definition of totalitarianism, because we can describe any number of regimes that are not totalitarian. Militarism with resources directed to domestic population. This sentence feels incompatible. Militarism would be resources directed to the military. Resources directed to domestic population would be the exact opposite. The dichotomy would be the difference between one or the other. You can't put resources into both. That's obviously tautological and useless. Repression of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Okay, to what degree? There are periods of time in any government's history where they use wartime powers to repress freedom of the press. The United States did that in the Civil War. That doesn't make it a totalitarian dictatorship.
Of speech and freedom of the press, systematic elimination of political opposition by violence,
Okay, but you can have a totalitarian system without a strictly speaking, a violent system of political repression. So, like, for example, the political opposition to Israel is repressed oftentimes without violence at all of any significant factor, or at least violence that we would recognize as such. For example, that rapper who was at the Glastonbury Festival just this week has effectively lost everything he's ever worked for because he dared to get up and say death to the IEF. Wrong? No, he's ostensibly in a country with freedom of speech.
Expansionistic foreign policies and conquest through military might.
You've just described Rome. And any number of other topics that you wouldn't necessarily, or countries you wouldn't necessarily describe as totalitarian. That's a useless definition.
Already note that all three historical totalitarian regimes of the 20th century fit very neatly within this box.
Going back
So do all of them. Like, everything fits in the box if you make the box big enough.
to his definition of totalitarian dictatorship, it has numerous issues. Imagine a brutal and repressive dictatorship that for one reason or another is incapable of carrying out expansionist foreign policy. By his definition, this may not be a totalitarian dictatorship because it's not invading its neighbors. Now imagine a dictatorship that does carry out belligerent and hostile foreign policy, and even invades countries, but doesn't actually annex these countries, instead leaving puppet regimes in their wake. Maybe on the other side of the planet even. They wouldn't fit the bill. The only really good criteria on this list that is practically useful in any sense is, quote, dictatorial rule. It stands to reason that for something to be a totalitarian dictatorship, if such a thing exists, it must of course be a dictatorship. Beyond
I like this guy. Pretty smart.
that, the definition is so broad as to encompass virtually every nation on Earth. Most states engage in
Yeah, that was my point.
aspects of these things to varying degrees. The degree to which you believe any of these specific points apply to any specific nation is completely down to your personal understanding of these terms and the nations. You personally have to make an assessment of how strongly you feel that a nation has enough of these things to qualify. This isn't the kind of objective measure he portrays it as. To demonstrate my point, he says he'll prove that these three nations fit the bill, and to do so he literally just goes down the list and makes an assessment and says that they do. He does a little, quote, thought exercise to prove that 1940s Germany didn't have freedom of speech.
And are we sure? Well, let me prove it to you. Let's do a little thought exercise. You are in 1940s Germany. You disagree
How about we just do a source? What about a source?
with Adolf Hitler's opinions, so you go to Berlin and in front of the whatever government building that they have there, you say, Hitler was an idiot. Yeah. Do you think you're going to survive that?
This isn't how you work with history. You don't think your way towards an answer, you find evidence to back up your claim.
Like, okay, let's play this thought experiment. I walk up to a government building and say Hitler was an idiot. What if I run away really fast? Haha, you can't catch me. I'm the Nazi insulting man. Hee hee. What is that? What does that prove? No, like you can take sources and then you can look at data and then say, well, this person did this and then this happened. Which is what you're purporting to do in the first place, but not doing. You haven't actually proved anything.
His argument here is 100% reliant on your personal understanding of Nazi Germany, not related to any evidence whatsoever. His argument is compelling because you understand Nazi Germany to be oppressive, and you're right. But he's not actually teaching you anything. He's saying, you believe this, therefore my point stands. This isn't history. He's pandering to you, and even though what he just said was correct, it is still pandering.
So what this tells us is that these are not necessarily unique features of the right or the left, but they manifest as common ground on the extremes of said spectrum. It's the horseshoe effect. Extremes touch, even if
There is no such thing as a horseshoe. It's not a thing. It's a mirage that's largely created by people's understanding of authoritarianism as not its own thing. Authoritarianism can be held as a system by almost anyone. And there are subsets of authoritarianism like Nazism and fascism. And there are subsets of authoritarianism like Stalinism and Maoism. That doesn't mean that they're similar to one another or suddenly in a horseshoe. Nor does this bode well for his explanation of things as a spectrum. Because horseshoes are not spectrums, they are horseshoes.
ideologically, when compared with communism, fascism is indeed right-wing.
Horseshoe theory is complete bunk. It relies on surface-level similarities between certain right and left-wing regimes in history. I don't think
I really like Freda. It's like we're reading each other's minds.
historians put much stock in the idea, instead opting for a more nuanced and holistic analysis that doesn't entirely sideline the ideological differences between these regimes. What Metatron is actually observing isn't the similarities between right and left-wing extremes, but the similarities between two different regimes wielding state power.
Yeah, there's a second part to this too, is like this is a really compelling argument to people if they're stupid. Oh, they're both the same. They did same things. Hitler killed people, Stalin killed people. They must be the same. And that's not really an analysis. That's a literal emotional reaction to the situation. You don't look at anything any closer. Why did they kill people? Which people did they kill? And in this, you find questions and things that can be answered. And there are scholars that do this, nothing but this. This is the kind of dumb interpretation of history that you would expect from What If Autist. It doesn't involve history, it involves vibes, dude.
Reason I think that the horseshoe theory is compelling is that both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were ideologically opposed to democratic liberalism, which means that those regimes in many ways were both quite different from the ones most of us live under today. The difference from us, is something they both share, even if at a closer look the regimes really aren't that similar. A comprehensive breakdown of the differences between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union is beyond the scope of this video, so I'll move on for now.
Now, in Europe, conventionally, Nazism is generally considered to be a far-right ideology, and communism, which is, of course, a left-wing extreme ideology. But once you start to look at this from the American political perspective, then the situation becomes muddy, if you will, necessitating a more nuanced, item-by-item approach.
It doesn't get muddy at all. What are you talking about?
If you recall, early in this video he said that one problem with this is that Americans are trying to apply their 21st century understanding of politics onto a 20th century European political movement. And now he's saying that because there are differences between Nazi Germany and the positions of American Republican voters, the situation is muddy and Nazi Germany isn't entirely right-wing. Why are you looking at it, quote, from the American political perspective? Surely there must be better criteria than the political understanding of the median American voter, full of
Yeah, that's probably fair.
offense intended to the median American voter.
You see, the
That's also probably fair.
Nazis, for example, had nationalized healthcare. Government was deeply involved in every aspect of industry, so we're talking about big government. The Nazis were not in favor of free market capitalists.
Okay. Let's talk about Nazis paying for things in the 30s and 40s. Okay. No. Nazis were not involved in okay, how do I put this in a way that's easy to understand? If you're talking about a state-owned enterprise, you typically are talking about an enterprise owned by the state itself and not individuals in the state. So for example, the Port Authority is usually owned by the state. It's not owned by an individual in the state, but it is a state-owned enterprise. Let's talk about what they did in Nazi Germany. One of the great examples of Nazi Germany, and you, if you're a Hearts of Iron player, you're familiar with the term, or Hearts of Iron Germany player, you're familiar with the term, but you don't really know what it's about. Hermann Göring. It's a focus, and at least there was a focus in the old German tree in Hearts of Iron 4. Gives you civilian factories. It's cool. It's very helpful. However, what it was in reality was a series of business concerns that were owned by a party member, in this case, Hermann Göring, and used to enrich Hermann Göring specifically. So, did the Nazis own things with state control? Not really. They owned things with party control. And they made deals based on party politics and not the state. Because under the Nazis, the state was the party, and the party was the state. The other thing they did quite frequently, and it's another term you will recognize if you're a Hearts of Iron 4 player of Germany, is the MEOF bills. And like, it's a button, you click it, it extends your bonuses for another day. But what this was a Ponzi scheme. The Nazis made a false company. They sold shares in this company to civilians and unsuspecting buyers. And then they retained the option to extend the shares and never have to pay them out. And in this way, and we don't know how much money they took in this way, but this was how they disguised taking in money to rearm Germany. This is, again, like, it was a state-owned company ostensibly, but all of the money is funneled out of the state and back into the military. Is this socialism? No, not in any real sense. Is this communism? Of course not. So you can't really say that the Nazi Germany is like, oh, we have state-owned industry. Not really. They have state-influence industry, or they outright have party members owning industry. A lot of a lot of companies in Nazi Germany retained their ownership before and after the war.
And yes, I'll defend this.
No matter what part of the country that they helped. Like if you were manufacturing Zyklon B, not a lot of people were punished for that.
One in the next section. And all of this sounds left of center to an American. So it is mixed.
All of this is of course said with zero citations.
On the following section, I'm going to present the characteristics of the regime, and then you decide where it leans the most toward.
This is a trap rhetorically. I'm going to report and you decide, because the facts that he reports as objective can skew it either way with what he does or does not report. That's the oldest fucking trick in the book.
As so often happens, these guys pretend they're just presenting the facts, and then they pretend to outsource that analysis to you. A historian's job is to provide analysis, not to say, you decide what happened.
Yeah, we report, you decide is not a viable format for history writing.
Smiley face. They're being lazy, dishonest, and cowardly, and they hide behind this veneer of objectivity.
No, it's not being lazy or dishonest or cowardly. It's almost always intended to lead you in a particular direction. It wants you to land at their part of the analysis, right? He's already primed you for this by saying Nazis are left of center based on American politics. He wants to get you to go the rest of the way. He's put the ball in a particular court, and he's letting it roll down the hill.
To push impressionable people who are unfamiliar with the topic towards specific conclusions. In the following section, he doesn't cite anything at all, and for some reason brings up whether or not the Nazis had, quote, identity politics.
A central idea of communist ideology was opposition to private ownership of the means of production, which blended with economic intervention within the private and public sectors.
What do you mean a central tenet of communist ideology is economic interventionism in the private sector? A central tenet of communist
if there's a communist ideology that is opposed to private ownership, then there is no private sector.
Ideology is the opposition to the existence of the private sector. What is economic interventionism in the public sector? That's already owned by the state. That's the public sector.
Now, to that, Nazism was different up to a certain extent. Let me clarify. Their overall economic approach favored big business and opposed labor unions, which of course doesn't make it sound socialist by any means.
All of what he just said is correct. See Adam Tooze's Wages of Destruction or my past video, Capitalism in Nazi Germany, if you want more info.
Friedrich Pollock says, open quote, I agree that the legal institution of private ownership was maintained and that many attributes characteristic for National Socialism begin to manifest themselves, albeit still vaguely in non-totalitarian countries. But does this mean that the function of private ownership did not change? I believe it reaches far more deeply and should be described as the destruction of all the essential traits of private ownership.
He quotes Friedrich Pollock as to why Nazi Germany's private ownership was functionally destroyed, and I'm pretty certain he got this quote from the Mises Institute, which is also where Tick History, who I covered in the past, got a lot of his stuff from. The Mises Institute is a right-wing libertarian think tank. Metatron, of course, doesn't cite this quote properly, and in this instance that is more important than you might think. For one, he actually misquotes Pollock, and
well, more to the point, again, it's really useful to not have a place for someone to go to look up the quote, is if you're trying to bamboozle them.
Leaves out the ending of the sentence. When you want to cut off parts of a quote that aren't relevant, you should indicate that you have done so. He does not. The full quote reads, should be described as the destruction of all the essential traits of private ownership, saving one exception. Pollock's argument isn't that capitalism is gone, it's that capitalism's management has been transferred into the hands of the state, while keeping the actual ownership and profits in private hands. He calls it, quote, divorce between ownership and control. It's conceptualized as state capitalism. I don't fully agree with that, but that's what Pollock believes, and it isn't quite what Metatron represents his beliefs as. This isn't the most important thing that Metatron leaves out, though. The most important part is that this was written in 1941, long before any serious historical appraisals of Nazi Germany had been undertaken, by the simple virtue of the fact that the Nazi period wasn't over yet. Even the economist writing here, not as a historian but as an economist, cannot hope to have all the information and data necessary available to him. What follows is an argument that Hitler would allow private ownership and management of business so long as the businesses complied with the needs of the state. And in Metatron's view, this isn't really private ownership or capitalism. He calls this
socialism disguised as capitalism.
This is central.
That's not a thing. That's not a thing. Like, okay, that fundamentally misunderstands what socialism is, first of all. Socialism is the state owning the means of production as a vestment of the people. Capitalism is the means of production being owned by private property, and if it's still a matter of private property, then it's not socialism, and it cannot be socialism.
To his argument that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were cut from the same cloth. He says that Nazi Germany looks like capitalism, but is actually socialism. What follows is a very funny section that might seem familiar to some that have watched my old videos on What of Old Hist. These guys all use the same talking points.
Alright, now I would like to dedicate a small section to race. With that being said, let's also remember...
Is it the kind of race that you run on foot? Please tell me it's the kind of race you run on foot. Please tell me you're not going to be a weird little racist.
That if you think that racism denotes right-wing position, then you would classify Karl Marx as a right-winger. And the reason I say that is because if you actually read the article he published in 1844 called On the Jewish Question, you would absolutely consider to be racist.
He claims to have read On the Jewish Question.
Okay, he hasn't read On the Jewish Question. Here's a really interesting fact for people. The phrase "the Jewish question" was, up until Nazi Germany, a really common phrase to be used by Jews, Zionists in particular. And it was one of the central ways they shorthanded the debate about what Zionists should aim for, what they should do. You find it again and again in Zionist writings. What the Jewish question, what should we be, what should we become? Because Zionism is concerned with two things. It's concerned with nationalism, and it's concerned with Judaism as a faith, as a spiritual force, and as the soul of the Jewish people is what they think the question is. And so the Jewish question is what do we do? What is the course of action that Zionists should take? Should we return to Palestine? Should we go elsewhere? Should we settle in a different place? This is the writings that pre-World War II Zionists would have. The question for them was largely settled by the Holocaust in a lot of ways. But this is what the Jewish question is in historical context, well before it ever becomes a dog whistle for killing Jews. So no, that's not what Karl Marx is writing on the Jewish question. He's participating in that debate as a Jew. Like he's participating in this historical discussion. Wouldn't the conclusion that Nazis are left of center from American politics equally be that American politics is more right-wing than the Nazis as much as Nazis are left-wing? Yes, it would be. Even prior to that was a question about what Jews and Judaism should do in the face of emancipation and nationalism. Yeah, that's part of it. I kind of would call that the precursor to Zionism, though, in a real sense.
But probably hasn't, or if he did, he didn't really understand it. It was written in response to Bruno Bauer's The Jewish Question, hence the title, On the Jewish Question. Bruno Bauer's text is very anti-Semitic, and Karl Marx is arguing against Bruno Bauer's anti-Semitic arguments. Karl Marx himself was born to a Jewish family. To modern ears, much of the language employed by Marx and even the title understandably sounds shocking, but that's because we're viewing it outside of its historical context. That being said, there are examples of Karl Marx being overtly racist in letters, particularly towards
yeah, he was kind of a jackass.
LaSalle, which Metatron could have highlighted. Karl Marx undoubtedly harbored certain anti-Semitic and other racist beliefs, but bringing up this particular text is a very lazy and widespread right-wing talking point that isn't really convincing. I would argue that Karl Marx was perhaps less racist than the average German man in the 1800s, but that this also isn't saying much because German men in the 1800s were very racist. I won't belabor this point because the point Metatron is trying to make is silly. Racism is not an inherently right-wing position, and nobody sensible would argue as such. Anyone can be racist. I believe he's saying this defensively, because he himself knows that racism is more prevalent on the right. In fact, much of this video can be viewed as defensive, particularly the last portion in which he gets very hung up on whether or not Hitler is a Christian, which I don't think is very relevant. In the conclusion to this video,
Actually, it's a really interesting point because, like, I have family members who are still militantly atheist, and while I am an atheist, I'm not necessarily militant. Who cares? This is the same problem that you find out, well, Hitler was a vegan, or Hitler's a vegetarian, therefore all vegetarians are evil. Hitler drank water, therefore water drinkers are evil. No, not how that works. Hey, Titan.
video, Metatron invites you to do a political compass test and try to imagine what Hitler's answers to each question would be, and then see where you end up. Once again, relying on
This is a fucked up thing. Like, oh, imagine what you think, how you think Hitler would answer, and answer that way. Again, this is going to link inherently the bias of the test taker to the flaws of the test, to their own interpretation of what Nazi Germany is. It doesn't rely on, like, let's go read what Hitler thought, which is readily available in a massive rambling book called Mein Kampf. All of which is possible, but not going to be illuminated to you if you decide to take a political compass test, air quotes mine, and say what Hitler thought.
Your preconceived notions of who Hitler was, instead of actually educating.
Therefore, Nazism should not be judged by whatever words Hitler crafted, and it should not be considered neither left nor right-wing, at least.
Nazism should absolutely be judged, at least in part, by the words Hitler crafted.
In the political sense. The only thing in which Hitler believed was accumulating personal power. And we have a name for that. Totalitarianism. Thank you for watching.
Well, no, totalitarianism is about state power. The personal, like, you can have a totalitarian country without personal power. We associate it heavily with cults of personality, but it does not require a cult of personality.
To conclude, I'd like to read a couple of quotes from Roderick Stackelberg, an expert on Nazi Germany. The conventional image of Nazi Germany as a totalitarian monolith in which every aspect of life was totally controlled from the top is misleading in several respects. For one thing, it implies that Nazi rule was maintained solely by coercion rather than, as was more generally the case, by popular consensus. The three dots indicate that I'm skipping later to the text here. It should be remembered that much that took place in Nazi Germany was not distinctively Nazi. Most importantly, perhaps, the monolith model fails to take into account the persistence of conflict and differences within and between government, party, and societal institutions, despite their hierarchical command structures. Quoting him again from the introduction. In my interpretation, Nazism is unambiguously a movement of the right, a conservative end of the spectrum. Stackelberg approaches some of the topics that Metatron brought up early in this video, like Americans getting confused about how to interpret Nazism from their perspective, totalitarianism theory, and on similarities between extreme movements and so on. I would recommend reading this book over watching Metatron's video if you would like to understand Nazi Germany. I think Metatron isn't a very big fan of Hitler, and is understandably also not a fan of his politics and his views being associated with Hitler, which is why he wants as much distance as possible from him and his movement. Of course, no reasonable person is going to look at the Nazis and think that they were left-wingers, not
Yeah, but now I know what my Metatron thumbnails are going to look like.
even Metatron thinks that. So his only recourse is to say nothing and pretend like it's nuance. I remember Metatron as a channel that did talks on history topics, but now it seems to largely be low-effort React content. And I mean lower effort than mine. I at least, right?
Yeah, some of us put some effort into this. We've done 20 minutes and I've been speaking for 50.
The script. And also it seems much of it panders towards right-wing young men who are frustrated about video games being too woke.
The usual politics in games and the culture war. In this case, the battleground is Oblivion Remaster. Man, Elder Scrolls 6, I really hope they don't put politics. I really hope they don't inject.
Politics is unavoidable. Okay, we're going to take a hot second break. Take 5. Walk around. Get some water. We'll be right back. Okie dokie, we're back. But yes, I watched a couple Metatron videos this week. They're bad. There are plans for you in the future, son. We're going to have so much fun together.
A lot of politics in these games. If it's a tiny little bit, it's not a big deal. I'll mod it out. And I'm just being honest with you. I'm not being hateful. I don't hate anyone. Live your life however you see fit.
He says if you're gay, if you use
It sounds like you do hate people and you're just too much of a pussy to say so.
them pronouns. If you've got blue hair, then more power to you, so long as you live your life somewhere where he doesn't have to see you.
Final Fantasy Tactics is one of my favorite games ever. That game is so political that it's insane, but it's not divisive. But it's also the idea of using the video game as a medium to inject your positions. That's when I'm starting to have a problem, because it feels like I'm being manipulated.
He's scared because
No, that's how media works. It communicates positions to you. Congratulations. Welcome. Welcome to the 21st century.
the things he's seeing are different to what he's used to. He's not taking any sort of principled stance against people, quote, injecting their politics into games, because then he very much would not like Final Fantasy Tactics. Let me read what the original script, scenario writer, and editor's thoughts were on the politics of the game, published on June 5th with the announcement of the game's remaster. Quoting Yasumi Matsuno. Nearly 30 years ago, the collapse of Japan's bubble economy engulfed the nation's financial institutions in mountains of bad debt, triggering a wave of corporate bankruptcies, a sudden and extreme rise in unemployment rates, and stagnation of Japanese society as a whole. It was an era when many were robbed of hope, when dreams were measured by their price tag. Against this historical backdrop, I crafted a story. It was the story of Ramza, a young man who fought tirelessly against the entrenched social class system. It was the story of Delita, who sought to take advantage of this confusion and despair to advance his own social position. It was a story of a peculiar destiny in which friendship and betrayal intertwine. And now in 2025, a time when inequality and division are still deeply rooted in our society, I offer this story once again. The will to resist is in your hands.
What are you trying to inject in my head?
Let's move on from Metatron.
Global warming or whatever eco-disaster thing you want to sell.
Now, I've challenged many politically correct people. There were so many fifth columnists and communists and the like dissenters.
This much loved and admired design of tank that the Russians built in World War II. And I just want to show you how bad it was in so many ways.
I still remember
Lindy Beige is an interesting character. We'll just leave it at that.
one video that stuck with younger me quite a bit. I think it was around 2012 or so when I started playing D&D. I saw a video of his where he reasoned that adventurers spelunking through dungeons and caves probably wouldn't carry their torch in front of them, because the bright light would interfere with your eye's ability to adjust to the darkness. Instead, you'd carry the torch to your side and behind you, so you can see what's ahead while carrying some light with you. And I thought, wow, he's smart. So I mostly watched for that kind of content, medieval fantasy and roleplay.
No, okay. You would hold the torch above you, but that's beside the point, and to the side.
Type stuff. Like the rest though, I started to notice things as I started learning more about how one works with history. Lindy Beige is a reasonably old man, I think, though he's aged quite well, probably by virtue of being an avid dancer and not having his brain broken by the 2010s. Out of my selection here, he's probably the most normal one of the group. Many of the things he says and believes are kind of indistinguishable
Yeah, that's probably fair.
from what that one slightly racist old guy at the pub might say after pint number 5. He complains about largely non-issues in a curmudgeonly way like Metatron does, but his issues are that someone at his dance rehearsal didn't like his gendered language, not that Nexus Mods is censoring his favorite anti-woke mod. It feels just as trivial of a topic to make a video about, but at least it's less terminally online. Lindy Beige's history content is mostly sort of okay. It's entertainment. He mostly just talks about things he likes and finds cool. It's not super informative or well researched, but it's not terrible either. He's maybe going to say some weird
He's not my favorite sweater-clad YouTuber, that's for sure.
things about women, non-binary people, climate change, the British Empire, or indigenous people, but if you look past that, then it's mostly okay, I think. Here's a video he did at the Bovington Tank Museum about the Soviet T-34 tank from World War II. I chose this video because it's relatively recent, it's something I find interesting, and as you'll see, it fits the theme of my video.
But the Sherman was not actually the most common tank of World War II. No, that honour goes to the Russian T-34.
He refers to the tank as a, quote, Russian tank throughout the video, and whenever he refers to the Soviet Union at any point in time, he keeps referring to them as, quote, the Russians, with one exception.
The Russians, and the Russian tanks. The Russians, big Russians.
The Russians.
This might sound like a nitpick, but this was not a Russian tank. This was a Soviet tank. The tank was designed and manufactured in Kharkiv, Ukraine. To many, this stuff is understandably touchy after Russia invaded Ukraine. Kharkiv sits quite close to the Russian border, and its civilian population is frequently victimized by Russian drone and missile attacks. Even if it wasn't for Russia's war of aggression, consistently calling it Russian is just wrong.
It is, however, a very common habit for people of a certain age.
Was Soviet. Strangely enough, at one point he calls the Soviets,
Like, particularly anyone in Gen X or older is going to refer to Russians as Soviets interchangeably.
the Russians, says the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and that the T-34 was made in Ukraine, all in the span of about 30 seconds.
The crudeness of this tank is just funny. I mean, the crudeness of the casting here, it's just so lumpy and bumpy. The quality of the metal is not the greatest, and some of the welds are hilariously bad.
Now, I'm going to complain about how he keeps talking about how aspects of this tank are bad. But on several occasions, it seems like he understands their purpose and understands that the T-34, which he says could be manufactured at a rate once every half an hour, is by that virtue better than the statistically equivalent German tank that took 6 months to produce. He oscillates between evaluating the tank as a whole as a seemingly good tank, and also calling every aspect of it trash.
Here's the trouble with weapons. Weapons have to be fit for purpose. And if your purpose is to come up with a weapon that is reliable in all conditions, you're never going to make it. If your purpose is to come up with a thing that you can produce en masse and deal with problems, then you will make it. Why is my thing not working properly? There we go.
I'll get to why I think that is later on. I don't know much about metal quality or welding. I've never welded something in my life. I asked military history friends and an actual tanker about some of these things, but all that is anecdotal, unverifiable, and not very persuasive when making arguments about history. Does the lumpiness and bumpiness actually mean the tank's going to be less effective? Do the appearance of those welds mean that? What sort of actual effect does this have on the tank's ability to serve its purpose on the battlefield? Do any of these things actually matter? It's easy to look at things that look bad and reason that it must mean they are bad, but how are you actually judging the quality of anything you're looking at? He doesn't go into detail, he just says it.
And I mean, to be frank, it was T-34s that drove through Berlin and not Panzer IVs driving through Moscow. So ultimately, that argument kind of loses any kind of impact.
It's bad.
And some of the welds are hilariously bad.
Quoting from the first page of Chapter 1 of the Tanks of Operation Barbarossa, one of the most widespread mistakes is the tendency to look at tanks from former years from a contemporary standpoint and to evaluate them using modern criteria. Such an approach has its attractions. In the first place, it is simple, and secondly, it allows us to sense our superiority over the people of the past, who created and used those tanks, in which today we see so many imperfections and flaws. At the same time, often blaming of one or another detail of a tank for its shortcomings is in fact a result of the elementary misunderstanding of how, why, and for what purpose each detail was made part of it from the beginning. Whatever led to the welds looking so crude may be a deliberate design decision and actually be a bonus to how one should evaluate this tank. Quoting again, there is one more important category that influenced the design of tanks, the level of modern technology. Not only at the abstract worldwide level, but in the manufacturing capabilities of each specific factory that planned to produce them. This also includes the number and qualifications of its workers, the presence and capabilities of its manufacturing equipment, its financial resources, the availability of time, raw materials and component parts, the possibility of cooperating with other factories, etc. In other words, an assessment may have been made that a satisfactory quality of weld was achievable at the planned production factories with the available skilled labor power, with available raw resources, and that a quote higher quality would not be worth an increase in labor power or a lowered rate of production. Now, there's actually a much more important factor to mention when it comes to the welds, that Lindebeige unfortunately does not mention. The so-called prettier German tanks often utilized interlocking armor plates which had to be hand-welded by highly qualified electric welders. As Germany had no shortage of skilled labor or machine tools, production wasn't limited by this. Instead, it was limited by raw resources. Soviet tank production faced
The other thing that German wartime production is limited by extensively is the inability to take resources from where they are to where they are needed. And this is very much an impact of Allied air power as the war goes on, but it's also bad logistics.
different challenges. The T-34's production utilized, quote, the foremost technological achievements of that time, which included automatic welding, as opposed to highly skilled and time-consuming manual welding. A good rule of thumb if you're ignorant about something from the past is to start from the assumption that they knew exactly what they were doing, not that you're smarter than them.
They thought to themselves, well, a tank's going to last maybe, 3 months in action, so why make it so well crafted that it'll last
They didn't think that at all.
for 70 years. No, it's going to blow up in 3 months, so make it good enough to just about last 3 months, and then it'll have done its job. One way of looking at it is it's like a hand grenade. It's a disposable item that you
That's not a way to look at tanks at all.
use them up. Now,
Is that so much different from any other tank? Yes, tanks were not designed to become museum pieces, yet here you are standing in front of one, and according to the very museum you're standing in, quote, after the war, T-34-85s continued in service around the world with over 40 nations for many decades. There are 3 T-34-85s at Bovington. I don't know which one he's referring to at any specific point because he never says, but all 3 have different histories. This could either be one that was used in the Korean War, one used by the Czechoslovakian army, or one built in Poland between 1951 and 1955. Only one of these 3 is confirmed to be wholly built in the Soviet Union. One's hull is confirmed to be built in the Soviet Union, and one was entirely built in Poland. These factors may all play a part in the way the tank appears.
so you can see actually it does overhang the front a little bit, and they've just there's a bit of a bodged solution there with a extra bar of metal added on.
Botched, meaning make or repair something badly or clumsily, but he doesn't really go into why that little bit of metal is bad. Quoting once again from the same book, from the same first page of chapter 1. It should be noted that the success or failure of various models of tanks is determined to a great extent by their capability to be adapted in a timely manner to the constantly changing tactical demands throughout their service life. If an
All true.
adaptation could be made by welding on a tiny bit of extra metal, that seems like a very cost-effective solution.
Look at the quality of the craftsmanship. Look at this just gap. They haven't welded it. There's a gap between the side plate and the back plate. And these bolt holes, you see, don't all have bolts in. But what the hell, that's enough to hold it on. They shove it out the factory, it'll be
How do you know, looking at that is not an artifact of the restoration?
fine.
On the topic of the lack of bolts and the missing weld, allow me to quote again, this time from chapter 9. The result of fasteners used to build the tanks noticeably decreased, and a large number of superfluous parts were discarded. For example, by the beginning of 1942, 5,641 parts of 1,265 items were removed from the tank's design, and by the end of that year, this figure reached 6,237 parts. In the process, the list of fasteners was reduced by 21%. According to a graph on the same page, the labor input between January 1942 and July 1945 was at one factory reduced by as much as 62.4%. Granted, that factory had required a much higher initial labor input than others. At the seemingly more efficient Kharkiv plant, the reduction in the same period was 39.5%. These weren't just cost-cutting measures to make things cheaper, these were measures taken
These are I've seen some context around these facts, but this is what you do, right? You look at the thing and you take the data. You don't just sit there and look at the tank and go, look at all these missing bolts.
to adapt to the realities of the war, to maintain rate of production in the face of, quote, colossal human material and manufacturing resources left behind in occupied territories, the mass evacuation of industry, the loss of economic ties, and the overloading of the transport system with military shipments and the interruptions in deliveries of components, parts, and materials in connection with this.
And even today, it's so lovingly looked after by the people here at the Tank Museum at Bovington. You see it's dripping oil onto the deck, black. I've seen almost no oil dripping onto the ground from many tanks, but this one does.
He spots an oil spill, and that could have been formed for any number of reasons. I asked my
Why? Yeah, okay.
tanker friend, who told me, quote, if it's a class 3 where a puddle is formed, that means it's deadlined, but not like a, oh, you can't use it. More of a, oh, regular maintenance needs to happen soonish. He also told me any military vehicle like this will face maintenance challenges like this under the stress of use. Even so, this speaks to a larger problem with how Lindy Beige approaches history. He saw that puddle and reasoned his way towards what actually was going on instead of figuring it out. He believes the T-34 is a shoddy piece of craftsmanship and
Yeah, there's a great joke. Sherlock Holmes and Watson are sitting out in the stars, and Sherlock turns to Watson and says, Watson, what do you see? And Watson goes, well, I see many stars in the sky, Sherlock. And Sherlock's like, well, Watson, what does that tell you? Well, astrologically, it tells me that We are soon going to see great fortune come upon us. Meteorologically, it tells me that tomorrow should be a beautiful day. Spiritually, it tells me that God is great and that we are small and insignificant. Why, Sherlock, what does it tell you? Watson, someone has stolen our tent.
Spots a small oil puddle and uses it to confirm his preconceptions, instead of asking, what caused that? He reasons that since he hasn't seen any oil puddle near any of the other tanks, this must mean this is an issue with the T-34. Then he moves on without considering what could have caused it. I'm not one to get involved in these weird discussions about what equipment was best or anything of the sort. I also have
Me either.
no special attachment to the T-34. Granted, it is the first and I believe the only tank that I've seen with my own eyes, so in a way that makes it special to me, but it's also just a tool of war.
It was not the first tank I saw with my own eyes, nor will it probably be the last.
Oscillates between calling every aspect of the T-34's craftsmanship rubbish, and evaluating the tank as a whole as a tank that does its job. When he talks about how the tank sucks in various ways, he's looking at it not as a historian, but as a fan of tanks. He's looking at it from a very subjective aesthetic perspective. He thinks elements of it looks ugly, so he critiques that. He thinks it's poorly constructed, so he critiques that. He sees improvised adaptations and doesn't like that. He makes reference to how British tanks do things better, because he thinks those are cooler and more practical.
No one thinks that, by the way.
Those familiar with him know he's a bit of a British nationalist. But then he steps into the historian role and says that the T-34 is statistically just as good as the Panther, but the T-34 took 30 minutes to make, and the Panther took 6 months, which obviously would make the T-34 better. And then he goes back to talking as if the T-34 is something bought off of Temu. My problem is that he doesn't make it clear when he's speaking as a fan and when he's speaking as a historian.
Yeah, I would have a hard time disagreeing with any of this.
He could have just said, personally, I think this looks ugly, or he could have said, you might think the lack of welds and bolts here looks bad, but actually it was found to be superfluous and its removal reduced labor hours for production significantly. While it seems he wished the tank looked prettier, Lindebeige does arrive at a sort of conclusion that what matters in war is having equipment that does the job, and that something cheaper with downsides is better than having nothing at all, which is a correct conclusion to draw. Quoting from the tanks of Operation Barbarossa, the worst tank in the world, which manages to show up at the right time in the right place, is immeasurably superior to the best tank, which fails to arrive.
Having a tank is better than having no tank when you need a tank.
When and where it is needed. For all these citations for this book, by the way, I would like to apologize. I have an ebook version and it's difficult to cite accurately.
That's why I don't get ebooks. I go and find myself a physical copy.
Unfortunately, while Lindebeige does seem to reach this conclusion, which I believe is correct, he does so after almost half an hour of talking about how every which aspect of the T-34 was, quote, bad. Quoting again. Firepower, armor protection, and mobility are the most significant of the tactical and performance characteristics of tanks. That is, after you've taken stock of the tank's availability. And even so, it has to be operated by a trained crew and used in a cohesive tactical and strategic whole to be effective. In the period under discussion, the medium tanks showed this balance best of all. From the period of view of the level of development of these three characteristics and their optimal balance, the undoubted leader among both Soviet and German tanks was the T-34. That's not to say that T-34s didn't have flaws, wasn't lacking in certain things, and so on. I'm sure it was. It's just to say that at the time, by sensible non-video gaming metrics, it's probably all around what best suits the needs of its nation in World War II. I think the T-34 was probably a good tank.
More or less.
Lindebeige has a website where he's posted little essays. In the opinion section, he's highlighted some of his most controversial ones. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a date stamp on any of these essays, but I also couldn't find any sort of retraction, apology, or corrections, so I assume they still in some way represent his views. I'm happy to be corrected on that, though. Your eyes might be drawn to his, quote, "What Holocaust?" essay. It luckily isn't what you think.
Oh, good.
Takes exception to the term Holocaust on the basis that overemphasizing the Jews killed in the Holocaust may erase the millions of others. Personally,
That's probably fair, to be honest. The German war crimes and exterminations of the 1940s and 30s happened to multiple groups. And I get the ick, as the kids say, when one group is emphasized over the other.
I think Holocaust is fine as a term to encompass all the peoples whom the Nazis attempted to exterminate, and personally I prefer the Hebrew term the Shoah when I refer exclusively to the Jews persecuted during the Holocaust. One point I want to address in his post here, though, is his use of the term, quote, attempted genocide. This is a common misconception. The Nazis did not just attempt a genocide, they carried out a genocide. Genocide is a legal term, and its definition is set out in the United Nations Convention on the...
I would expect that he's trying to argue that it's an attempted genocide because they did not fully annihilate the peoples in question, which is not required for it to be a genocide, nor do you have to kill a single person for it to be a genocide.
Prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. It reads, quote, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. What's important is intent, and having carried out any of the acts under Article 2 with that intent. The intent must be to destroy it in whole or in part. And you can in fact be found guilty of genocide without having killed a single person. Here's how he introduces one of his essays, quote, in the far north of Scandinavia live people called Lapps. In a large country in Central Europe live people called Germans. The Lapps do not call themselves Lapps anymore, it seems. Interjecting here, they never did. Germans do not call themselves Germans. Political correctness now demands that I change my habits and start calling the Lapps Sami. Political correctness is inconsistent, however, and allows me to call Germans Germans. It's not the best source, but I don't have a source specifically on the term Lapps, so I'm quoting the Norwegian Online Encyclopedia's article on the term. This is authored by senior researcher Mikkel Berg Nordlie from the Oslo Met University and linguist Asbjørn Nesheim of the University of Oslo. Translation mine. Quote, Lapps is an outdated term for the Sami, which was used by non-Sami. Because of societal racism towards the Sami in the 1800s, the reigning term for the people gained a negative connotation. In Norway in the 1930s, the term Lapp was officially replaced by the Sami's own word for themselves, and following the Russian Revolution, the same occurred in the Soviet Union. Later it happened in Finland and Sweden too. This was a term used by the state towards a repressed indigenous minority, not a term they use themselves. It's taken on the connotations of an ethnic or racial slur, especially when utilized by people insisting on this word that hasn't seen official use in almost a century. The Sami understandably do not like it when you say, I prefer to use a different word to describe you, when that term coincidentally was also used by the people who carried out an ethnic cleansing campaign against your ancestors.
Yeah, there's a bit of ick there.
And used the term to otherize you. He conflates a lot of different things like how the BBC pronounces Kabul or how people call it Germany and not Deutschland, none of which are ethnic slurs. Quoting Lindy Beige, I am told that these days the Lapps have started to get shirty about whether people say Lapp or Sami. This is an insane thing to say about someone not liking a slur.
Oh, okay. Imagine if someone got up and said, yeah, those black people are getting real upset about being called N-words. No shit. You don't say. Oh, God. Oh, I love these people.
By the way, quoting further, this is a case of the small group trying to get power over the larger by claiming some degree of oppression and
Well, no, it's a not a claimed degree of oppression. It was a demonstrated degree of oppression. They got killed.
Insisting that the larger changes its habits as some sort of pointless and ultimately denigrating concession. It sounds to me like he's saying that Scandinavia is like a Sami-occupied government. His point here is to say that the Sami are denigrating themselves by basically being childish and not being able to...
We might have to make Lindy Beige a frequent appearer on our prepared content as well.
Tough it out, I guess. It's incredibly pathetic and funny that he views this as the Sami oppressing him. He also says, quote, a word that simply describes you is only insulting to you if the person you are is bad. If you are...
Well, that's funny coming from a limey like you.
Bad, then surely you deserve to be insulted, and I would rather that you become good than merely change your name. Lindy Beige, I'm going to call you an idiot for this take. You're going to take exception to that, and you're probably going to get offended by me calling you one because you don't believe you are one. Mind you, this entire post happened because a Swede dared to correct him on a term that hasn't been officially in use in Norway, at least, for close to a century.
Oh, those Swedes always being, a little uppity.
Now, when I see someone launch down a tirade like this, I usually expect them to eventually say why they should be allowed to say the N-word. Luckily, he doesn't do this, but...
In this essay, the next one to be forthcoming.
He gets really close.
Hang on. I'm not reading this out loud. The useful, accurate, and unambiguous one which names a type of person. If someone tells you should not use the word, then they are more powerful than anyone else, powerfully, suggesting there is something shameful about... Okay, I'm not saying that out loud. Guys, I think Lindy Beige might be a teensy bit racist. He was in the newspaper for telling vegans to eat lard. That's just fucking funny. Okay.
Now the sentence just sounds so fucking bad, I don't want a recording of me saying it out there. Now, I'm not even talking about this term in specific, but in a general sense, it's actually the opposite of what he's saying here. There's something shameful about letting someone refer to you by a term that's intended to assert their inherent superiority over you in racial terms and to belittle you. It doesn't matter if you know they're wrong, because if enough people treat you like this, then they've made you their lesser. This is not...
Yeah, that's the thing about identity, guys. Identity is complex. You might see yourself as one thing, but you're not only what you see yourself. You're also how people treat you. And if you are treated and disregarded and discarded by society, you are those things, even if you don't see yourself being that thing. Or at the very least, not escaping that problem of being seen as that. That's not how identity works. Like, Lindy Beige has got some weird conception of this.
How you treat an equal, or treat someone with respect. Lindy Beige spends a great deal of time talking about how getting offended by this sort of stuff means that you're childlike and in need of coddling, not seeing the irony of saying this in a 19-paragraph essay spurred by a Swede simply advising him to not use an offensive term that's outdated by close to a century.
Was it 19 paragraphs? One, two, three, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and a postscript. There are many, yes, that Beijing. Okay, moving on. That is as bad as it looks.
You're the one who seems in need of coddling, Lloyd. Moving on from that, he also has an essay on women's role in society. Lindy Beige believes that a woman should be in the home and not the workplace. I think he best sums up how he wants to express his view.
Well, that was expected.
By the following quote. My feeling is that people should act in whatever way is more likely to make them happy. Coercion tends to prevent happiness, and freedom tends to promote it. I do not think that a woman's place should be forced on her. I think that women should be free. I also think that if they were truly free to pick the path that would, for them, lead to the greatest contentment, that many more of them would end up not going to work. Personally, I think the same applies to men, that both would prefer not to spend half their
I would have to agree. Like, who really is looking forward to going and working all the time?
Taking days in service of enriching the owner of their workplace. Lindy Beige here instead highlights what he calls instinctual differences between men and women that just so happen to correspond to his worldview. These are differences in things that cause fulfillment for men and women, and he says that women would be better served to get money from a man than having to labor at a job and in the home, and so on. The text is full of
That's absolutely untrue. I am perfectly happy to accept money from men and women alike. In fact, you can see our donation link pinned to the top of the chat, or in the description box if you're watching after the fact.
Presuppositions and assertions of how things are and how they seemingly have to be. Quote, it is commonly remarked that men do not like to marry women who earn more than they do. Society at large does not respect the kept man. Given that this stems from deep-rooted instinct, it is incredibly unlikely that this will change in the near
Deep-rooted instinct? Yeah, that's not a thing. We've talked about this before.
future. We could try and educate people to respect kept men, and kept men to be happy being kept, but this would be going against the grain of human nature. Surely
No, it wouldn't.
it is much better to go with the grain of human nature. He conflates much of what he observes with so-called human nature.
Yeah, your reality does not constitute a natural state of nature running all the way back to the beginning of humanity. That's not how it works.
Humans are social animals. All social organizations we create are a product of human nature, because constructing complex social organizations are an inherent part of us as a species. This could be the family, the village, the nation-state, the trade union, and even capitalism. All of it is a product of human nature. It's in our nature to construct complex social organizations, and to sometimes replace those with ones that better suit us. He talks about how unaffordable housing is and how
Sometimes we replace them with things that don't suit us at all, like the nuclear family.
the mobilization of a greater number of the population into the workforce isn't necessarily to the benefit of women or men. That competition between these social categories isn't helping either. Quote, governments could not simply intervene and lower the price of housing. Attempts to force people to sell things for less than they could get them for always fail one way or another. Something is only ever worth what someone else is prepared to pay for it. It could be that men
But that's not the case, right? Plenty of people are willing to pay for a thing, but they're not willing to pay that much for a thing. How does this sit in the market empty all the time because people are not willing to pay the price for those houses? It's usually when you end up with a house that's housing boom that people are paying too much for houses that aren't actually physically worth that. Jemt, did you just send me in the middle of a stream a 3-paragraph essay on what he's calling an MG32? Or excuse me, an MG34? You did. It's my fault for not muting my phone.
have ended up in a world where male virtues are criticized in all but the successful few, and in which their male instincts cause them to pursue lives that will bring them little pleasure. Meanwhile, women cannot feel respected without independence,
I'm filing your MG34 paragraphs under the John Spencer file.
but cannot get enough money without dependence on a man who might be gone tomorrow, so they still have to go out and get jobs. He ends with, quote, there must be a better way. His problem is that his vision for how to improve things is constrained to his narrow conservative worldview. Emancipation from all these things that weigh on our lives and force us into molds we don't feel happy in is going to require rethinking a great many things. He brings up how many of the jobs that await women aren't fulfilling careers but just simply
Possibly some kind of leftism.
jobs, like scanning groceries behind a register and such.
That's the thing I love about conservatives. Conservatives are so deeply unsatisfied by society, but then want to keep it exactly as it is. Like, oh, this thing sucks, but we must continue to have this thing that sucks, or else the world will end. If we don't have the thing that sucks, the world will end. That's not how the world works, but it's also, like, funny. Like, they're kind of stupid on a really primordial level. Conservatives generally. Just really dumb.
This isn't the reality of women he's describing. He's describing the reality of workers. If you're watching this video, you're likely either a worker or you'll become one very soon. You'll be competing for jobs against fellow workers, to the benefit of the owners of the workplaces, who are looking for whoever will do the job for the lowest wage, because the higher your wage, the lower their profit margin. You will spend a great deal of your waking life maximizing that profit margin. There must be a better way.
Warhammer have been getting more and more corrupted by the woke mind virus.
Every time you complain about Warhammer being corrupted by the woke mind virus, we are going to trans another custody, Shad.
Abraham had more than one wife, yet they were shown in visions as standing on the right hand of God in an exalted state. So clearly there's a mechanic or exception which permits someone to have more than one wife.
I learned of Shadiversity through a video called Names and Terms of a Medieval Castle's Parts that I saw in 2016. At the time, I thought it was reasonably informative. It's kind of like an illustrated list, like one of those visual guides you get as a kid with cross-sections in it. This is the kind of content he used to make. He still makes seemingly innocent content where he and his buddy play around with swords or pop culture props. However, the majority of his output, in terms of quantity at least, is on a channel called Night's Watch, started in 2020. This is your typical talking to the camera, low effort, right-wing opinion channel, covering stuff like Twitter takes and the Amazon Lord of the Rings show. That channel will be the majority of my focus. Shad is a practicing Mormon, hence his defense of having multiple wives. He's very serious about his somewhat fundamentalist Christian beliefs, which logically may lead to a more conservative worldview. Whereas Lindybeige seems to mostly have his own homegrown, curmudgeonly conservative gripes with society, Shad seems to be wholly immersed in the culture war.
Already weird things are happening over the years. There was one thing where they're trying to say it's for everyone while actually excluding, anyone who politically disagreed with them.
Yeah.
What he's referencing here is, I believe, a Norwegian YouTuber formerly known as Art Warhammer getting ordered by Games Workshop to remove the term Warhammer from his name because he was an out-and-about Nazi.
No, that's not what's being referenced. Okay. Let's do some Games Workshop lore. A couple years ago, they had an incident at a tournament in Europe. It wasn't a Games Workshop run tournament, but Games Workshop has been sponsoring a lot of its events, LVO, Adepticon, etc. So they've had a much more substantive presence at these than they have in the past decades. Let's find the original statement, and that will illuminate things. Why are my messages coming up automatically? That's unfunny. So this is from Warhammer's social media team, Games Workshop's social media team, rather. In June of 2020, there was a incident at a tournament not too long before that where someone came and was a Nazi. They had a Nazi painted themed army, and they made people uncomfortable. And it said, Warhammer is for everything. One of the great powers of our hobby is the ability to bring people together in common cause, to build bonds of friendship that cross divides. We believe in and support a community united by shared values of mutual kindness and respect. Our fantasy settings are grim and dark, but that is not a reflection of who we are or how we feel the real world should be. We will never accept nor condone any form of prejudice, hatred, or abuse in our company or in the Warhammer hobby. We will continue to diversify the cast of characters we portray through miniatures, art, and storytelling so everyone can find representation and heroes they can relate to. That part of the paragraph we can kind of crump around, argue about. If you feel the same way, wherever and whoever you are, we're glad you're part of the Warhammer community. If not, you will not be missed. This doesn't have anything to do with Archcast. They did Archcast dirty, not really dirty, to do brand protection. Long story short, this gets down to the classic problem of tolerance, or the paradox of tolerance from Popper. And again, I'm going to submit to everyone that the paradox of tolerance disappears when you treat it not as a paradox, but as a compact. I will be tolerant of you, provided you are tolerant of me. And there's a reason for this, because I can't exist or function in a system in which you are intolerant. There's no equality of action there. If you are intolerant and you are attempting to eliminate my ability to exist, I cannot tolerate your existence. That's not a position we can negotiate upon. You have violated the compact. And in turn, you don't get to be part of that compact anymore. And there is a problem, I think, sometimes with Warhammer fans, and it was getting very, very apparent in 2016, 2017, 2018, and they started pushing back on this really hard. And so you had the reassertion of 40K being a satire, and you had that announcement, and like, you're not supposed to take Warhammer seriously or as a model of what to be, and that's what these people have been doing. They look at Warhammer and say, well, this is an explanation of the world, and we should use it as such, and it's not.
Initially, it was just Art Warhammer, because I figured, like, okay, I'm going to do Warhammer, so it makes sense to mention that in the title of the channel.
Absolutely. Why did you
Games
change it?
Workshop's lawyers disagreed.
I'll cite a compiled list, which itself has links to his videos. Arch's channel was basically him reading fandom wiki pages in a fake British accent that made it sound like he owned colonies in the West Indies, while calling goblins house N-words. When Warhammer took action against Arch, they also released a statement, which is what Shad is referencing here. I'll read the statement to you. Warhammer is for everyone.
No, this was released well before that.
One of the great powers of our hobby is its ability to bring people together in common cause, to build bonds and friendships across divides. We believe in and support a community united by shared values of mutual kindness and respect. Our fantasy settings are grim and dark, but that is not a reflection of who we are or how we feel the real world should be. We will never accept nor condone any form of prejudice, hatred, or abuse in our company or in the Warhammer hobby. We will continue to diversify the cast of characters we portray through miniatures, art, and storytelling so everyone can find representation and heroes they can
We're transing the custodes.
relate to. And if you feel the same way, wherever and whoever you are, we're glad you're a part of the Warhammer community. If not, you will not be missed. Games Workshop is saying that Nazis are not welcome in the hobby. Shad is offended by this, or at the very least pretends to be in order to appeal to his Nazi or Nazi-adjacent fans. This is pretty unambiguous because Shad specifically mentions Arch Warhammer.
Yeah, not Arch Warhammer, not him, but it's for everyone, right?
Yeah.
So much of this is 2014 to 2016 internet coded that they even managed to name drop Sargon of Akkad.
Because Sargon of Akkad said you can't have anything exclusionary, even when things are already represented. Oh man.
This is so nuts.
For some reason, Shad is also obsessed with AI. If you've seen his Twitter, you'll know that it's pretty much all him coming to the defense of AI as, quote, tool-assisted art or something like that. I don't really have a dog in this race, beyond the fact that I think AI art looks like dog shit. He's really up
Usually it does.
his own ass about it though, and berates artists about how AI art is better. For example, here he's saying Studio Ghibli's art style is, quote, plain and, quote, uninspired. This stuff is very personal to him, as evidenced by this part of his, quote, love letter to AI video, which sits squarely on the intersection between
That's not creepy at all, making Supergirl a small child.
sweet and kinda weird, I think.
I had a big crush on Supergirl growing up and have a lot
Then why is she a small child?
of nostalgic connection for this character, and what I love to do is to depict my wife as Supergirl because that's who she is. She is my Supergirl.
I don't know what to
Okay, that's just a fetish.
say about this stuff, but I thought it bears mentioning since a lot of people have very strong opinions on the use of this technology for so-called art, and it seems to be a pretty big part of who he is right now. Shad is a big fantasy nerd. I am too. I've been playing D&D since about 2012 with some of the same people that entire time. I read fantasy books growing up, and when I've traveled recently, I've been reading Ursula Le Guin's books of Earthsea. Shad did what a lot of fantasy nerds who also become YouTubers, gain an audience, and with it an ego do. He became an author. His universe or book series is called Chronicles of Everfall, and his first book is called Shadow of the Conqueror. It is
Okay, I have read parts of this book. It was so repulsively weird that I could not finish it.
a world of floating islands. The story takes place after the big fantasy villain was deposed by the good guys. The main character is this deposed fantasy villain. For some reason that is apparently never revealed, the deposed villain eventually feels remorse for his actions, and the setting's analogy to God then gives him a shot at redemption, transforming him into a 17-year-old version of himself, for some reason. I will gladly read an entire book on history for a video, but I refuse to read a YouTuber's first fantasy novel, so instead I'm going to read you some choice reviews. Before I do, though, I need to give a quick content warning. Apparently the book contains copious mentions of sexual assault.
Yes, there is a higher than average per capita amount of rape fantasy happening in this book.
And some of it being against minors, so I will be using words that some might find unpleasant. Quote, "This is a difficult review to write. I'm biased to like the author based off of his YouTube personality/channel. Because of that I want to like this novel, however it is rough for one minor and one major reason. So the minor reason is that the book needs editing. Quote, as is, the novel is very often expository, dumping mechanics, systems, and seemingly logic asides all the time. The tone of the written prose is fluctuating wildly, with supposedly heart-wrenching monologue from a character in one line and utterly neutral side on some tangent to the next line. For example, quote, blood was easy to wipe off because it's mostly water." Wait, what? The biggest issue, however, that keeps me from rating this novel higher is the novel's constant obsession with sex and rape. The main character is largely defined by it. Almost all the female characters with more than one line dedicated to them are either trusty home-sitting wives, quoting, "with breasts like melons," religiously obsessed with cooking for their men,
Oh dear.
and sexing with their men, or they're absolutely and utterly defined by having been raped and or kept for sex trafficking. And okay, if this had been handled with care, okay, but the way these events are treated, like offhand mentions with no apparent empathy from the characters or author beyond the briefest of lip service, is genuinely discomforting. From another review by Kevin Potter, now I have very two large issues that almost made me drop the book and get a refund on numerous occasions. 1. Rampant and awkward sexuality and rape. There are multiple characters completely defined by their sexual assault. 2. The main character.
Yes, one of the main characters, in fact.
There are so many issues here, but let me condense the list to a few key points. After being with him for 18 hours, I can also say there's not one thing about him that I like, largely because every positive thing presented just rings false. At the end of the day, he's still a bastard who raped young girls and killed millions. Here's another one by Chelsea, who said she did not finish it. I love Shad's YouTube channel, and this was a promising premise, but the novel is annoyingly unpolished and objectionable. As for the unsavory elements, there are copious references to rape, ravaging, and sex trafficking, as well as bestiality. What?
I mean, everywhere. It is everywhere in this book.
I didn't pre-read any of these, by the way. I just scrolled down the Goodreads review list and looked for reviews that were sizable, not 3-word shitposts, and generally started with, I love this guy's YouTube channel, but... And a final review by Hope C. I'd really give this negative stars if I could. I'm just here in an attempt to reduce the inflated score. Making your protagonist a genocidal pedophilic rapist who gets away with it, becomes young and handsome, and then everyone forgives, that doesn't belong in published books. It belongs in long-deleted Wattpad stories. This guy's channel is almost all tired or angry opinion videos. It's hard to tell to what degree this stuff is meant to cash in on the online right-wing outrage farms, and to which
I don't know how much actual value we're going to see from this, and it has almost been 2 hours. I like this. Go subscribe to Freda. Good stuff. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Have a good one.